Welcome to this episode of Moments in Leadership. First, a thank you to Colonel Rich Martin, United States Marine Corps, who made a great introduction to Master Gun Scott Stalker, who is my most recent guest. Rich, thanks for being an advocate and contributing to the project. Really appreciate that, since my main pipeline to guests is now referrals and intros from other people. And on that note, if you can make an intro to a guest, please email me at themilloffice@gmail.com or DM me on my Instagram account, which is @themilloffice. I also have links in the show notes here for both of those. I get a lot of messages that sound like, hey, you should get so-and-so on, and those are great, but without a warm intro, it's just an idea, and I really don't have any other way to reach out to them. So that's the best way to help. As always, thanks to my Supercast subscribers. Without you and all the supporters helping out, this would be way tougher than it is. You're proven advocates for the project, and for that, I am deeply grateful to all of you. And as you know, your contribution to the project helps me defer the costs of the episodes. And I'm halfway to breaking even on them, so your support really means a lot. And if you want to support the project and help underwrite the costs, see the link in my show notes to the Supercast sign up. The benefit you get is that I release the episodes about a week early for you to hear before everyone else. Okay, with that, this episode is with Brigadier General Val Jackson, United States Marine Corps Reserves. A native of New England, then Second Lieutenant Ray entered the Marine Corps from Boston University's NROTC program in 1994. She completed the Basic School and Basic Communications Officers course in 1995, then reported to Marine Wing Communications Squadron 28, or MWCS 28, in Cherry Point, North Carolina, as a communications officer. And while she was there, Lieutenant Ray served as the Wire and Radio Platoon Commander, Detachment Operations Officer, and then Executive Officer, and then deployed as an Embassy Liaison Officer in Lima, Peru. Lieutenant Ray then joined the Marine Combat Training Battalion, MCT, School of Infantry East in 1997 as a Company Executive Officer to assist in female enlisted integration efforts. In 1998, then Captain Jackson transitioned to SOI's Headquarters and Service Battalion to serve as the Marines awaiting training and Headquarters and Service Company Commanders, and finally as Headquarters and Service Battalion Executive Officer. Then in July of 1999, she transferred to the United States Marine Corps Reserves. In August of 2003, Captain Jackson became the Peacetime Wartime Support Team Officer in charge for India Company, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines down in Little Rock, Arkansas. Major Jackson joined the Marine Corps History Division in 2006 as the Senior Editor and Field Historian, where she revitalized the division's historical publication Fortidine, and then covered theater security cooperation exercises Cobra Gold in Thailand and then African Lion in Morocco. In 2008, she assisted in the development of the first United States Marine Corps Civil Affairs MOS school, and then in 2009, Major Jackson deployed to Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF as we know it, in support of Marine Expeditionary Brigade, Afghanistan. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson then joined the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, 2MEF, as the CMO planner in 2011, and the G6 as the Reserve Operations Officer in 2013. Subsequently, she then served as the Marine Forces Reserve Force Headquarters Group G6. Then in December of 2013 through May of 2016, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson was the commanding officer of the Marine Wing Communications Squadron 48, or MWCS 48. And then in May of 2015, she transferred to the 8th Marine Corps Recruiting District as a recruiting support officer in Dallas, Texas. So between 2016 and 2018, then Colonel Jackson assumed command of the 4th Civil Affairs Group, or 4th CAG, down in Hialeah, Florida, before taking on the role of Deputy Division Head at DCI, where she served until October 2020. Colonel Jackson subsequently served as the Vice Chief of Staff for Mar4 Res until March of 2022. Then after her promotion to Brigadier General in 2022, she assumed the role of Reserve Deputy Commanding General for 2MEF until January of 23. And then following that assignment, Brigadier General Jackson deployed to the Horn of Africa as the Deputy Commanding General for CJTF HOA, where she served until June of 2023. And then in June of 2023, she assumed command of the 4th Marine Logistics Group. She holds a Master's in Strategic Studies from the United States Army War College and is also a distinguished graduate from that course. She has a Master of Arts in Liberal Studies and Conflict Management and Resolution from UNC Wilmington and a bachelor's in history from Boston University. And with that, welcome Brigadier General Val Jackson, United States Marine Corps, to the podcast. I do have to say, ma'am, that thank you so much, because you're the first female Marine officer or first female officer to come on at all. And this is very exciting. The audience has been hammering me on emails and direct messages online to, get some female leaders on. And I'm really excited to have you on as the inaugural female officer. So thank you so much for taking a chance on the project and getting involved.
Yeah, my pleasure, Dave. Glad to be here.
I'll actually, for the listeners, I will replay the conversation that you and I had, because we met at then Lieutenant General Dave Bellin's retirement, and we were introduced by Gunnery Sergeant Seitz, who's on the Sergeant Major Marine Corps staff. And she said, "Hey, you should talk about being on." I didn't even have to pitch it to you. You're like, "Great, set it up. Let's do it." So I didn't even need any convincing. So that's really awesome. I do love the fact that this project is really contributing back to the development of the emerging leaders. So having all these different people on is so exciting, but it gave me an opportunity to meet somebody I would have never met before. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here, Dave. And I'm really thankful to Gunny for the intro.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so, kind of curious, who's Val Jackson? How did you get into the Marine Corps? And I really want to focus, what was it that got you to want to become a Marine? And then, boom, tell me about Second Lieutenant Val Jackson.
Well, way back in the 1900s, yeah, I knew this is, it's almost a little hokey, but it still rings true for me. It's like becoming a Marine was a calling. I knew in the 8th grade I wanted to be a Marine. My dad was a Vietnam Marine. My grandfather had fought in World War II in the Army. Military service was always a thing in the background. My dad ended his career in the reserves for the Marine Corps. It was just always something that was never spoken, but underpinned, I think, the way our family ran. And my older brother really was on the track to be a Marine. He was not able to do it for some medical reasons. I just idolized him, and I said, I want to do what he wants to do. And by the time I was in the 8th grade, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I just put my head down and tried to do the best I could in school and in sports. And then when it came time to start applying for colleges, I headed that way. And interestingly, I thought the only way to become a Marine officer, at least for women at the time, because there were more limitations back then, was to go to the academy. And so I said that to my guidance counselor, and she said, well, forget about it because you don't have the SAT scores. And I wasn't off by much, but I was below what they said minimum score was. So I thought, okay, well, I guess that's a bad idea, and pivot to something else. But there was a Marine reservist that lived down the street from me, and he said, you should apply for an NROTC scholarship. And I said, well, what is that? Found out about it and applied in my junior year of high school. Barely got a 3-year scholarship back then. I was a good student, but, high B+ average maybe. And I was, a varsity athlete in a couple of sports and a class officer, class vice president. But the competition was really stiff. And so I ended up getting a 3-year scholarship and then ended up at BU, Boston University, I should say, for the people in Texas. I think
right,
BU is Baylor.
Right.
Yeah, and did NROTC there for 4 years and then got my commission.
That's awesome. So that's very similar to the track I took, except I think you did better in high school than I did. But yeah, so did you do college program was your first year for free in ROTC and then you got the 3-year scholarship?
I had the 3-year scholarship. It wasn't college program. It was some weird hybrid they don't do anymore. So my dad paid for the first year, which was still ridiculously expensive even back then. And I was guaranteed the scholarship as long as I got a 2.5 GPA and a letter of recommendation from the professor of naval science.
Okay.
So I had to participate and do all the things. I just wasn't on scholarship that first year.
Gotcha. Yeah, similar to me too. I had to pay my first year in ROTC. I was a midshipman at the University of South Carolina. I was a little bit before you, so I was still in the 600 ship Navy buildup, and I was post Top Gun. My freshman class in ROTC had 100 people in it. The whole freshman class. It was insane. But
wow.
So I remember those days too, and then having to apply for it and then getting told, and I got the Navy scholarship and then transferred it over to the Marine Corps right away, which I think was
good choice.
I know. I think it was a little underhanded, but that's what my MOI told me to do. And he was a Vietnam Mustang. I wasn't going to not do what that guy said to do, so
seriously.
So ROTC. So was that back when you did Bulldog, right? 6 weeks OCS?
Yeah.
Was it a blended gender OCS yet, or did you still have the company that was all females?
No, we had our platoon, Golf Company, second platoon, was female. And there were 13 of us. and we graduated 11. And we were the first female platoon ever to win the drill competition.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we were pretty excited. And, we just competed with the other guys. There were 3 other platoons, I think, in the company. But yeah, so we were in a male company.
So let me do the math on that real quick, because in my platoon at OCS, I was also golf too. So like we were the hot company, right? When it was like August.
Yeah, oh yeah.
There was like 40 something of us in that platoon. And we had the officer and 2 sergeant instructors. Okay. I'm assuming you had the same for 13. Like the ratio there of getting yelled at must have been.
We had 3.
Oh my gosh.
We had the officer and 3. We had 2 staff sergeants and a gunny. So there was nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
There were no wallflowers. They saw and heard absolutely everything, which was difficult for me. The hardest part of OCS for me was keeping my bearing.
Okay.
because I thought they were just funny. Like what, all drill instructors or sergeant instructors, like, unless you're the one getting yelled at, a lot of what they do, if you're witnessing it, if you're a Marine, you think it's funny.
Right.
And I thought they were funny, but it was, there was a lot of personal attention.
Yeah. That is a ratio. Like you said, there's nowhere to hide. So you stayed together as an all-female platoon in the overall company, but there must have been times where you were doing Sully things, but there must have been times where you were meshing a little bit, right? Or did they keep it completely?
No. We saw them. We saw the guys a lot. And as a matter of fact, I don't know why, we did not have rifle racks in our squad bay. So every evening we had to go and put our rifles in the male squad bay. And it was always a thing because we're in PT gear and the male sergeant instructors would yell at the guys to like turn around or avert their eyes or whatever. And then ours would threaten us, be like, don't you look at those nasty boys, and, keep your eyes head straight to the front. And it was just this whole show every night,
right,
of us storing our weapons over there, which I have no idea why that was the case.
Yeah,
but anyway,
we had a rack in our squad bay too. That's weird.
Weird. I don't know.
I went back to OCS as a captain. I was telling you before we started recording that I had some broken time, and so I had to go get re-sworn in as an officer. So and it had to be done by a commissioned officer. The only person I knew who was around at the time was a friend of mine, Dave Mills, who served an entire career in the Marine Corps on the logistics side, but he was a captain at the time at OCS, and I had to go swear in. And I was like, how do I get to your office? He's like, come up the center stairwell. And I walked in that middle door. I was like, for listeners, as a candidate, you're only allowed to use the stairwells on the outside of the building. And like to come up the middle thing, I almost had a heart attack, just an anxiety attack, walking up those middle steps and walking in. And then it was funny because like everything seemed so much smaller to me when I walked back in there as an officer. I just remember it being so much bigger, and I don't know, it's such a weird thing to see it, but I can close my eyes and see that squad bay, like I'm sure you can too.
And you can probably hear your whole unit clanking over that metal bridge, over the train tracks, over to the old chow hall too.
Right. And that bridge is still there, but they moved the chow hall. It's not over there anymore.
Yeah, it's on the same side as everything else.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so finished OCS.
Won the drill competition.
You go back to ROTC, and that's your senior year, right?
Right.
Okay. Then commissioning rolls around. So talk to me about the day you graduated from college, and then boom, you check into TBS. What was going on there? Was it integrated at TBS yet? Was it?
Yeah. So I showed up. So there were 4 Marines in my ROTC class, 2 women and 2 men. And the guys were starting right away. They were going right into Delta Company. But back then, there weren't women in every company. And so the next company picking up was Echo Company. So we had to sit around for a while and wait for that company to pick up, which was a little frustrating because we were ready to go. So I did, there was Mike Company, but Mike Company now is very formalized. There's a training schedule, there's PT, like we were just kind of left to do our own thing, which was not great.
That's how I remember Mike Company. It's where you went if you got hurt.
Yep. Yeah. So we were essentially like holding, waiting for a company to pick up. Not a great program. I actually went down to Camp Lejeune to try out for the All-Marine softball team.
Okay.
And I left halfway through for a couple of reasons, but one of them was I got deathly ill. I don't know what kind of virus hit me, but I was down and out for a couple of weeks. And by that time, I figured I needed to come back. and sit down and get my strength back and get ready to train for Echo Company. But yeah, there were 2 women back then, 2 women per squad in the companies that had women in them.
Say that one more time.
2 women per squad.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was starting to integrate a little
Yeah.
bit. Okay.
Well, yeah, they had done some experimentation over the years, as I recall. Now, my friend who went through 2 years before me, she was a whole female platoon inside a male company, like my OCS model.
That's how I remember it.
Yeah, but I've talked to some older women who went through in like the late 70s or maybe 1980, and they said, "Oh yeah, they just stuck us in the male platoons."
Huh.
So, yeah, it wasn't novel, but it was becoming more regular. But one of my best friends to this day was one of my roommates, and she had been there for a year waiting to pick up
Oh,
because she
God.
had hurt herself after OCS. She was a physical stud. She still is. Because there was no company with women in it, like all year, she had to wait till our company. And so, she had a lot of lieutenant time at the basic school. Anyway, a lot of wasted time.
Yeah. I think if you get stuck in that my company rotation, you can end up sitting at TBS before you do anything for like 6 months, maybe even a year.
Yeah.
So, okay, you're at TBS. This is pre-women in combat arms. I feel like
Yep.
it was right around when they started letting women fly combat
Yep.
aircraft, maybe, right? So
Yep.
we're in that portion of our history. What was it like when MOS selection came up and you're like, okay, you can only pick these things? That was still a thing, right?
It was still a thing. I think we all knew what we were getting into. Nobody in my cohort was like, man, that's BS. Like, I wanted to go to IOC, like, because I think we had prepared, most of us. I had mostly academy women and ROTC in mind. We didn't have really only 1 or 2 that were kind of like off the street OCS types. So we knew we'd spent 4 years like studying the Marine Corps, doing the midshipman thing. We kind of knew what to expect or not to expect in some cases. The thing they opened up, I think in my company, we had the very first female combat engineer.
Okay.
Yeah, so that opened that year, and pilots. I actually took the test that was called the AQTFAR. I thought I wanted to fly. I was right on the borderline for height, and some people will laugh that know me. That's no surprise. I'm not super tall, but my story is we had just come out of the field when I took the test, and I was smoked, and I failed it by 1 point. So I figured, okay, well that's fate. Maybe I shouldn't be flying. But I picked comm. Not because I was a super technical person, because I'm not. And again, people who know me will agree to that. But at that time, I was told it was the best opportunity for women to lead. And all I wanted was to be a platoon commander. I was like, I don't, Intel interested me, but then I was like, well, you just have 1 or 2 Marines that work for you, maybe as a lieutenant anyway. I was like, I want a platoon of Marines. And so I picked comm, and my bottom of the bottom third standing at the basic school played in my favor. and I got it. So yeah, I was really fortunate.
God, we have almost similar stories even to this point in our career too. I was bottom of the third also, like the top guy in the bottom of the third. So I was lucky I got my first choice, so artillery. But okay, so you wanted a platoon, you pick comm, you go to school. Is that 29 Palms? Is that where officers go for comm school?
No, it was yes now, but at the time it was here on Quantico on what is now the campus of MCU.
Okay.
But I had missed, so they were only running comm school maybe once or twice a year, and I had like a 5-month wait, and so they sent us to our units untrained. So I arrived as a basically trained lieutenant, no MOS, and I was there from March until, don't quote me on this, but it was like maybe 3 or 4 months before school started. And so I arrived and they said, hey, pack your bag. We're going to this big exercise out in Fort Bliss, Biggs Army Airfield in Texas. So I went to Comm Squadron 28 at Cherry Point.
Okay. So you check in before you even go to comm school.
Yeah.
Did you get a platoon, or were you just
because they were short officers, and so they gave me a platoon. Yeah.
Let's talk about that. So gender integrated at that unit, right? And so you walk into your platoon. I'm just going to guess predominantly male, and you probably had a male platoon sergeant.
Yep.
Good guess. Okay. What was that like?
I'm trying to remember even that first platoon. I may have had 1 or 2 women total. And it was wire platoon, Det Alpha, MWCS 28.
Okay.
That's what I had. So wire platoon, and think of like like the old switchboards with the wires where you plug in if you want to make a call here to here. They were an interesting group, somewhat underappreciated, but like the backbone of wing communications really ran on the work that those Marines did. They were very young. There was a warrant officer that showed up maybe halfway, like when I got back from the exercise. So, like a warrant officer one, he was, I don't know. So I was 22. He may have been 28, 29. He wasn't too much older than me, but I don't remember any gender issues at all in that platoon. In my subsequent platoon, I did have some issues, but those Marines, and what I think was kind of funny is they knew I hadn't been to school. They knew my status, and they were like, this is interesting. And so I was just leading them in the things that I learned at the basic school. How do we appreciate, basic tactics? How do we perform in the field? How do we PT? How do we come to appreciate Marine Corps history? Like all those things. And that served me really well. And then I let them teach me too. They had me wearing tree gaffs, and I was going up a telephone pole wearing tree gaffs because that's what they had to do to string wire, stripping wire with my teeth instead of using my Leatherman, like slash wire,
Right. Yeah. Put that on your VA claim when you get out.
That's right. So I have this little chip on my tooth right there. No, but they were fantastic. And then when I went to school and I came back, they gave me a different platoon. They gave me the radio platoon, which actually had more women in it.
Okay.
And a platoon sergeant that was 20 years older than me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What rank was he?
So he
she
started he was a staff sergeant. It was a gunny by the time I left, but he joined the Marine Corps, became a Marine in 1972, which was the year I was born. He was protesting the Vietnam War, had a change of heart, and decided to become a Marine. He was something else. But he and I were a good team, and I learned a lot from him.
So can we stay there for a second?
Sure.
Because one of the things that people really enjoy about this project is when I have this discussion with people about the very first relationship that they have with their platoon sergeant or vice versa. And one of the points I try to make is that staff sergeant in any MOS has probably been at that, I'm just going to broadly categorize it as the company level where you're branded. So they could have had like 10 years in the same basic organizational structure. Here comes this brand new lieutenant. They can see 2 or 3 or 4 different second lieutenants over the course of the time as a staff NCO in a company, in a unit led by a captain in 03. They have this huge impact on 3 or 4 or 5, not probably 4 lieutenants that can come through during their time as a staff sergeant. Whereas we as officers generally only have 1 or 2. So that relationship that gets formed is so critical to an officer's future success. And I don't know if staff NCOs actually inherently understand how important they are to the development of a brand new lieutenant. And then I'll punctuate this by saying every single commandant of the Marine Corps started out as a second lieutenant with a platoon sergeant somewhere. And those platoon sergeants probably had no idea that they were grooming a future commandant in the Marine Corps. And so when I think about the impact that a staff NCO has on a brand new officer, it's just so formative. So I'm wondering if you can share some of your experience with your first or second or both platoon sergeants and how formative they were, or maybe not formative.
I have been so fortunate in that department. I've talked to peers, or I've seen it in my own formations where you have officers that struggle with their staff NCO or their senior enlisted leader, and that just is not a recipe for success at all. But as a young officer, it's so important to have that really good, grounded staff NCO. I need to go back, though, to NROTC, because that's where I learned how that relationship works. And I think that's one of the beauties of NROTC is that Marine AMOI. So there was the first one I had my freshman year was sort of like, hard as nails, like old school kind of guy. And
let's define the AMOI too before you get into it too much. Like you and I know what we're talking about, but in Navy ROTC unit at a college, there is a staff of active duty officers who are assigned there as a tour. And you've got the Navy officers, like there's usually an aviator, a SWO, and a submariner. And then the Marines have a Marine officer instructor or an MOI. generally a very senior captain or major. And then the AMOI, which you just referred to, which is the assistant Marine officer instructor. And that's generally a gunny. It was when I was there, could be a senior staff, but always off the drill field. They had some sort of drill field experience, I think.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's how it worked.
Yes. Yeah.
At least back when you and I read it.
Yeah.
So when you're about to tell a story about your relationship with your AMOI, the senior enlisted, the only enlisted Marine on the staff.
Yeah. And so he, like the first guy was scary, but he got me through my freshman year. So the second guy was different. And again, at this point, he's only, 29, 30 years old, was fresh off the drill field. And this was a new experience for him. But he was with us, the same group of about 20 to 23 Marine options throughout, in my case, 3 years. He ended up staying at BU 4 years. So he's shaped, quite a few officers that came out of there, both Marine Corps and Navy. But and we're still friends to this day, Master Sergeant Ward Warren, retired. He showed us, and he would tell us things like, when you get out of here, I'm going to work for some of you someday. So, hey, it's in my interest to make sure you're not all jacked up, right? And so there were things like, he was very careful to keep that line between his role and as an instructor and our role as students, but molding future officers. So he definitely pushed us to be excellent in every single thing that we did. He was very much a coach and a mentor, but still understood that one day, we would all outrank him, and just made us even realize things like, and I forget how it came up, but his pay, for example. So he had 3 small children at the time. And he just raised our awareness. It's like, yeah, when you graduate from school and you get, out in the fleet and you're making your first paycheck, you will make more as a second lieutenant, unmarried, no dependents, than I do right now as a staff sergeant, 3 dependents, 10 years in the Marine Corps. And that was shocking to us. We're like, well, how can that be? Why is that? But, he did it in such a way as not to be, make us feel bad about it. It's just like, hey, you just need to know this about this disparity between officer and enlisted. We lead different lives, serve the Corps, but it's different. And just from day one, making sure that we knew that. It was super important. So he really shaped that relationship for us. And so I had really high expectations because of him. And gratefully, most of the staff NCOs lived up to sort of the bar he set for me.
That's great. Was he there for your commissioning?
Oh, yeah. He was there for my commissioning, and he was there when I got promoted to Brigadier General as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah, he's a fantastic guy. But yeah, so I had in Comm Squadron, when I got my radio platoon, I had Staff Sergeant and then Gunnery Sergeant Fernandez, who was from New Orleans. I could not figure out his accent for the life of me. I grew up in New England, and I knew that accent. It sounded a little bit like that, but it also sounded like a little bit like Alabama. And finally, I was like, where are you from? And he's, New Orleans, ma'am. I'm like, okay, I've never met anybody from New Orleans. But he was, again, like 20 years older than me. So he was 42 years old, had to have gotten some waivers for his continued service and things like that. But he knew his trade enough to where he was effective in helping me employ the platoon. But where he really excelled was mentoring the young Marines, because he literally was like a dad to them, So when it came to sort of like the good order and discipline and life in the service and expectations and all that, he made my job so much easier. And I just learned a lot just from watching his interactions with the Marines that, I owe him a debt of gratitude.
That's great. And so that obviously transformed or continued into relationships that you had with your platoon sergeants as a lieutenant, right?
Right. Yeah. So he was single channel radio. He was my last platoon sergeant until I moved up into the detachment headquarters. And then from there, I transitioned out to School of Infantry East.
So talk about some of the relationships. Then you go to School of Infantry, female. I'm assuming that was kind of cutting edge or new. What were some of the relationships that you developed there that were also very formative to you growing up as a young lieutenant and junior captain?
Right. So in the late 90s, Headquarters Marine Corps decided to take and integrate Marine combat training, which is what all the enlisted Marines go through. It's like their equivalent of TBS before they go to their MOS school. I had no idea. I think most of the officers didn't till we showed up, that the female Marines prior to that would just stay on at Paris Island after recruit training and do about 10 days of, quote, infantry training, fan fire some weapons, learn squad formations, learn how to put your shelter half up, that kind of stuff. And when we realized that, we're like, this is shocking. And that was prior to 9/11. And I say to people all the time, like, can you imagine if we deployed to Iraq with female Marines in our formations that had 10 days of, what I call BS infantry training under their belt? And that was it. Like,
Hmm.
what an injustice, really. Dangerous, dangerous. Anyway, it's easy to look back and throw stones at the house, but that's how it was back then. So what they did is they decided to integrate MCT. They brought in female lieutenants to be company XOs of the training companies. And the training companies were led by combat arms officers, which is a story I can get to later. And then the cadre were chiefly grunts, but then you'd have some female NCOs as well. So they came from all MOSs, which most of them hadn't been through that training before, but here they were as squad leaders for the young female Marines coming through. So we had, again, it was sort of my OCS model, one female platoon per male, mostly company. So I went over, there was a first group of 4 female lieutenants. I was like the 5th to get there and to be a company XO. That was eye-opening because now I'm not working for commos, I'm working for grunts
Yeah.
at a predominantly infantry
Okay.
school.
What was that like? I mean,
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
You're right. So how about, can you jump into that a little bit? I think there's got to be some lessons learned there. There's got to be some formative moments there.
Yeah, there were, talk about mistakes made and things like that. I had been a company XO, a detachment XO. So when I got to SOI, I kind of used the same model. Nobody told me it was, bad or wrong. I thought, I did a good job at Comm Squadron. I thought, okay, I can do the same thing at SOI. And so I started doing the same things, concentrating on the same sort of admin tasks that the XO did at Comm Squadron. And my infantry company commander pulled me aside and he's like, you really need to participate a little bit more. I'm like, well, okay, sir, like, what are you talking about? Well, like, for example, when we do PT, you're never out there. And I'm like, okay, well, that's true. I am PTing, but I'm not PTing when you're PTing because I'm doing this other thing instead, which I would think had a higher priority. But in his mind, he's like, no, if you're a grunt, you got to get out there and PT. And I was at like all the hikes and all that, but sort of at the, group PT, if you will. Like you didn't tell me I had to be
Yeah.
there, so I'm not going to be there. And I'm going to do my XO things and get PT in when I can, kind of thing. But to him, that was a big deal. And so for me, that was the first, like, okay, this is going to be different. And his expectations, and it was the same. He was learning and I was learning, like, no, this is what infantry lieutenants do. This is what my XO does. Well, nobody told me this is how I did it, at Comm Squadron. So, there was a lot of that back and forth. And they weren't, no one was a jerk about it by any stretch on the officer side. I will say, on the enlisted side, there was a great deal, there was always respect, overt respect anyway, but a great deal of skepticism that I learned about later, which was really funny. I would have them individually come up to me and say things like, ma'am, when you first showed up, I wasn't sure how this was going to work out. I've never worked with a female Marine before. This is tough what we do. I didn't think you were going to be able to contribute and make this place better, but you really proved me wrong and just wanted to tell you that, and I appreciate it. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I thought that was a pretty good endorsement after the fact. But, it just goes to show that, like, the basic school system, like, it works. It's even better now than it was then, but even back then it worked. It made us basically trained, with basic infantry skills and the foundations that we need. So that was helpful. But SOI was my last tour on active duty, and there were 2 big reasons for that. One was when my company commander fleeted or left the company, I thought, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and take the company. I know this best, and this. I'd seen my friend do it in another company. She fleeted up to be the company commander and kind of did her thing. And in fact, it was my roommate from the basic school who was a PT stud. But then the school came back. Apparently, it went up even to the headquarters Marine Corps, like, no, you can't have a non-combat arms officer be the company commander. And I was like, well, this is ridiculous. Like I did TBS. I've been in the company. I've been doing the things. I know how it works. It's not too difficult. I have infantry SMEs in the cadre. Like, I'm not out there teaching them. I can lead the hikes. I can get, and these are all non-infantry Marines. Like, why can't I? And at that time, it was a 17-day package. And I was like, dang, I'm pretty sure I can do this. In fact, I know I can do it. But I was told I wasn't allowed to do it because I was not combat arms. So, that was my senior first lieutenant perspective of the way things went down. And they brought in my husband. He was my future husband then. We were dating, but he was at the infantry training battalion side of SOI, and his XO, who was an infantry lieutenant, came over to be my CO, and I outranked him. I was already selected for captain, and I was about to be promoted to captain, and here he was still a first lieutenant. I'm like, well, how are we going to do this? Like, that's not the way this works. And what are the Marines going to think? So they moved me to H&S battalion, to where I picked up a company, H&S company, and finished out as H&S battalion XO. So I was pretty frustrated.
This is why I've been so excited about having a senior ranking female, and it's because I just feel like how the molds, how and when and who broke those molds is so instrumental for younger emerging leaders to understand that it was things that you did and the questions that you asked and the questions that other people asked too. Like, why can't I be a leader, a company commander of this SOI? You were a participant in breaking those molds that don't really exist anymore. I don't know if that conversation would ever happen in 2024 about a female taking over. Those early and mid 90s Marines, female Marines, and women in the Navy were such mold breakers that, huge credit to you all for putting up with that shit. Only to make it better for everybody else 20, 30 years later.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Well, we were set up well. Again, I think I go back to, ROTC, for example. We were treated exactly the same at ROTC. When we did PT, we all did the same PT. The only thing that differed was when we did the PFT. When the PFT was, 7 iterations ago for women than it is right now. But we were same expectations. And so when we got to the fleet, TBS, same expectations for the most part. Got to the fleet, like, well, why would this be any different? You've given me the training. I know I can do this. Why can't I? I'm not asking to be a grunt. I just want to lead this company of young Marines that are none of whom are going to be grunts. That's all.
And as a skip down memory lane, I remember for people listening where there's always this casual debate over, are we lowering standards? Are we doing anything different? Okay, here's fact evidence that is not the case. Because I remember when the physical fitness test for women was a 1.5 mile run, not 3, right? Yep. And the flexed arm hang and not pull-ups. Right. And was it sit-ups? Was it still sit-ups?
Yeah, we did. We did max in 1 minute, vice 2 minutes.
And then the flexed arm hang, for people who weren't around, you basically did a chin up on the bar and held your chin over the bar as long as you could until your chin went under the bar.
Until your arms straightened, until your arms went straight.
Until your arms straightened. Okay. So now it's the same physical fitness test. It's the same combat fitness test. To me, again, more mold breaking, right? More just like standardizing the force. But when you talk about the PFT, I have distinct memories of women say, well, why can't I do the pull-ups? And in my ROTC unit, the women all did the pull-ups anyway. They didn't get tested on them, but they still did them when we did PT. So they were already doing all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I remember that very clearly.
I tell people now, because I can't do pull-ups very well at all right now, but when I was a lieutenant, I could do 10 dead hang on a bar. But again, I was never like required to do it. So I stopped doing them. And, 3 children later, it's a lot more difficult. The thing is like, people will rise to the occasion, given the time to get there. And you know what the expectation is going forward. Now, I don't know if as a young lieutenant, the PFT was what it is now, if I would still be around today. I don't know, because, my PFT personally has changed several times since I have been in, but thankfully we have the age gradation, and
Right.
and
Yeah.
and that's helpful.
Yes, there was no age gradation. I don't know if that's the right word,
I don't
but
either.
when I was in, and then as soon as I got out, they changed it and they were like, okay, you can row and you can do all these things. I was like, damn it, just missed it.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to go off on the sidebar for a second. But gosh, it really does get harder to run when you're older. Like it was the running that went down more than my strength or anything else, because the sit-ups and the pull-ups were always just strength-based. But boy, no matter how hard I tried, my run time just getting worse, or the pain associated with running and things like that. But
I
yeah,
agree.
probably a pretty smart move there.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to transition a little bit. You're a general now, right? So the amount of leaders that you have over you is smaller than the amount of leaders you have under you. But when you're a first lieutenant or a captain, it's almost inverted to that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious from that perspective of your time, let's just say before you got off active duty, what were some of the best lessons that you were taught by your worst leaders? Because you had a lot of leaders to choose from above you. Or maybe you didn't have any bad leaders. I did. So that's where the question comes from.
Yeah, so my very first detachment commander, which in the air wing, the squadron is the equivalent of a battalion. Instead of companies, you have detachments. And so my first detachment commander, no names, but super smart guy, super smart commo, brilliant. People skills, not great. Leadership skills, not great. And again, I chose comm because I wanted to lead, not because I have the proclivity toward technical things. But I hadn't even been to comm school yet. I show up, and 3 weeks later, I'm on a plane to Fort Bliss with my pack. I'm the only sucker just with my pack because we're going to the field. Everybody else has sea chests and sea bags and everything else.
Humvees, right?
Yeah. And so, he wants to make sure that my time is well spent out there and that I'm learning. And I'm on this rotation where I'm visiting the Marines in the platoon and other places in the detachment and seeing how the setup is. And in comm, there's the circuits, right? Like what is the comm architecture? And you physically draw, or now it's on a PowerPoint, I suppose, like how things are connected to other things and what makes the whole backbone work. And so he first exposed me to that, and he'd have like the circuit of the day, and all the lieutenants would have to assemble and talk about, solve for X, or, what is the circuit of the day? And if I take this piece out, what's the implication? I knew none of it. I was like, prick 77, after that, I'm done, because that's all we had at TVS. But he decided it would be a good idea for me to give the detachment a presentation on the difference between bit and baud. So I had no idea what bit or baud was, or what the difference might be. And when I went back to my Marines, the wire Marines, I was like, hey, what do you guys know about this? So this is 1995, so there's no we didn't have access to an internet, Google, I had no Encyclopedia Britannica packed with me in my pack. So I basically had to go around and ask people, and maybe that was part of his point, but it's still I don't know, it was embarrassing. It got to the point where I didn't want to interact with him at all, because every time I did, it was demeaning to me. I felt demeaning, whether it was his impact or his intent or not, probably not, but that's how it felt to me. And so my Marines would actually hide me and be like, ma'am, he's coming, and, go to the left or go to the right. But I had to give this presentation to everybody, and it was so embarrassing. And so what I learned from that, because it scarred me as a young lieutenant who was already not so confident in things technical, was like, hey, don't, if you can avoid it, embarrass your young leaders in front of the group, especially the ones they're supposed to lead. I had to lead those Marines, and I felt so foolish. And they felt badly. It was very awkward, very uncomfortable. But that was an early lesson for me dealing with him. And it just kind of never left. I've forgiven him. I've moved on. It just never left me.
Yeah, well, good for you. There's plenty of people I haven't forgiven yet. So you're a bigger person than I am. But, though, I wonder, I think as I listen to that story and kind of reflect on my own life, I feel like what I just heard you say and what I took away from that was, I think there was a propensity back post-Vietnam, early 90s leadership, let's just call it the pre-digital cami days, where there was this propensity of leaders to feel like they needed to break you down before they built you up. And that was happening. If you were a brand new second lieutenant, there was almost this debasing that had to take place. And then you get built up by who's supposed to be your mentor, which is the company commander or the detachment commander. I don't think that that's as prevalent anymore. I certainly felt like that was how they led at TBS, my SPC specifically. I felt like he was more like that. And some of the commanders I had when I was a younger officer had that sort of personality. I don't know if it exists anymore, but what you just described is exactly why anybody listening to this should be like, hey, listen, making somebody look like a fool is not the way to build them down and break them up. The other side of the story that you just told, which was how the Marines rallied around you to protect you and educate you and take care. And like, that's what you want to see in a unit. And for lieutenants that are listening to this, or if like, how will I know if I'm being respected? Like, if people are rallying around you and trying to help you, that's a pretty good indication that you're resonating with them as a leader, and you should take stock in that.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I really, I owe where I am today 98% to the enlisted Marine. Whether it was Staff Sergeant Warren back then, or the young Marines in that first wire platoon, all the way up. Like it is a symbiotic relationship when it's done right. But, like you said earlier, no enlisted Marine should ever underestimate their effect on the ability to form the leadership of the Corps at all levels.
They're the real mentors to a second lieutenant, not the company. Company commander doesn't have time to mentor everybody on a daily basis, but the staff sergeant does.
Right.
The sergeant does. The corporal does.
Right.
I like making sure that listeners make that connection and understand how truly impactful it is. Because like I said, there is a future commandant in the Marine Corps who's a second lieutenant right now, or a lieutenant right now.
Yep.
And somebody out there is having a massive impact on them. So that was great. Thanks for sharing that story. I want to jump forward to your time now as a general, but still have you reflect back on some of those early moments. But like, how did some of those early moments that we were just talking about, and maybe some other ones that we haven't talked about, but how did they shape tough or important decisions in your years as a senior leader? Let's just say 06 colonel and now general.
Yeah, as a lieutenant, you're very much relying on what you have basically learned. And I talked about how I was with my Marines in that first platoon, and even in the follow-on platoons that I had, about basic leadership skills, traits and principles, what's the expectation, setting the standard, all those things. When I didn't have the technical knowledge to share with them, or my experience, that's what I fell back on. And in some cases, so this is where I think maybe being a female Marine was a little bit different for me. I was very, very hard on my female Marines. Very hard. And I regret that, because I probably wasn't as encouraging as I could have been, and supportive. But at that time, in the 90s, we were really starting to break in some cracks into the, women in combat, integrated into all the MOSs, all that stuff. That's when those cracks really began. And so I felt like, if you didn't represent the way I felt like you should represent, which again is totally unfair, and again, hindsight's 2020. If you weren't living up to my expectation of what a Marine was, regardless of your gender, but almost especially if you were a female, you made us all look bad. I regret that. Where I've taken that now is where we have this big focus on retention. And I really started this when I probably, as an 06 commander, as a colonel at Fort Civil Affairs Group, when you had somebody that was struggling or underperforming in some way, was to really stop and to figure out why, like, what's going on. Let's just not hammer them. Like, okay, if you're a criminal, okay. But if you're generally a good Marine and you've done something like out of character, or you were late, or you showed up, disheveled, like whatever it is, like, okay, well, what's actually going on with that person? And finding out, if there are things that you can do as a leader to help, or the unit can rally around to help them, and not just crush their soul and tell them they're a dirtbag and kick them out. Like, no, okay, well, first of all, the American taxpayer and the service have invested in this person. They've made it this far. Like, it's my job to kind of get them over the line if they can recover. And some of those lessons from early on in my service, where it was almost like, Marines weren't disposable by any stretch, but there was certainly a mentality like, you either make the cut or you don't. And if you don't, I don't care why, because there's someone else right behind you. And I think we probably lost a lot of good Marines with that with that attitude.
I agree. I've had this conversation with other guests before. I think the conversation that resonated with me the most for listeners was with retired Vice Admiral Bill Mers, who was a submariner. And he talked about how they would remediate people on the submarine if they made an error or something. Whereas I'll just speak for the artillery community. If you're an artilleryman and you do something wrong and it causes a round to go out, shoot out, we call it, people are getting relieved.
Yeah.
There's no remediation. And I often say, like, how long did it take us to create the section chief that's, usually a sergeant in charge of a howitzer system? And there is one error and we're just going to double sign them and kick them out of the Marine Corps, or do we remediate? And I kind of wonder, from your perspective as now a general officer, do you think that emerging leaders can maybe modify the way they're thinking, or can we as an institution do a better job at remediating rather than hammering? Because I do think we're a hammering organization. I think that's our default, just culturally. But like, maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it's time to start thinking about things a little bit differently, especially in the vein of retention.
Yeah, and I will say, not that we get to, or I should talk about what happens in the boardroom, but there are more and more discussions now about, you look back at someone's record and you'll say, okay, well, if they had adversity, okay, it used to be like a hard stop, unless you're comparing, getting down to the last comparison of who should be in zone, who shouldn't, or whatever. But now there's more conversation about that. On the command deck, there's conversation about, okay, well, this person, had these very serious, incidents, but let me give you the background on that. Like, the commanders know now to come armed with that, because I'm going to ask questions and say, well, what's going on in their lives? Are they going through a divorce, custody battle? Did they just lose their civilian job? Like what is causing this behavior? Can you tell? If you can't tell, if the Marine won't share or whatever, then my hands are tied, and I can't help. But there is more of a sense of that discussion now, that there are some things that are unforgivable, character flaws, unforgivable. If you're a criminal, unforgivable. But if you have an honest mistake and it's not due to, laziness or cutting corners or things like that, there's more of a appetite to discuss how you might remediate a Marine or sailor.
Do you think there's an opportunity, or do you have any advice for leaders who are in a position? And when I say judge, I'm saying let's talk RSRO, right, on a fitness report, and they're in that position to judge somebody and formally evaluate them, and they've made a mistake. Do you have any advice for somebody, like, okay, maybe you let that go, or you handle it, quote unquote, in-house? I'm not saying like make them go dig a fighting hole, but I mean legitimately remediate somebody who made a mistake and chalk it up to a learning experience, versus when you actually formally catch. And I think you may have already answered the question by saying like it's a criminal, but that's kind of an easy answer. I'm not saying you took an easy way. I'm just saying that's a one that comes to mind really easily. But there's other ones too, right? There's like,
yeah, I have an example.
Let's go. I love examples.
My 05 command at Com Squadron 48 now in 4th MA. This is as a reservist. We were having a lot of alcohol issues. People like drunk in formation, showing up to work drunk, or out in the field drunk, whatever it was. And it was just like alcohol incident after incident after incident. And so we were leading up to a big exercise. Say this is probably February. The exercise was in April. And I said, the Sergeant Major, I was like, okay, look, now keep in mind the Sergeant Major and I are reservists, so we're not at the unit full time. There's an I&I staff of about, maybe 60 Marines. That could be wrong now. But anyway, there's a sizable I&I staff led by a major and a master guns. I said, okay, entire squadron, it's on your honor, but you need to be dry for the month of March. Okay? Dry. Because if you have a problem, this is going to expose it to you. But I also want you to know how serious I am about stopping these alcohol problems. You can't show up to drill, and party all night and handle dangerous equipment the next morning, either halfway intoxicated or, completely hungover. And we can't get the most out of you during the drill period if you're in this state. And this is just totally irresponsible. Anyway, so I made this policy, and I got a couple of those. Well, you can't do that, and that's unenforceable. And I said, yeah, probably, but I'm challenging the Marines to, be men and women of their word. Well, I had a young Marine, Lance Corporal, who was on the I&I staff, active duty, and as the CO in a squadron, integrated TO, so I had complete authority over this Marine who got,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
So you were writing a fitness
yeah,
report on an I&I Marine. Okay.
yeah, and that's how it was in the wing. Like we were totally integrated. My I&I inspector instructor was a major, also my XO, so everything was integrated. Though he was there day to day running things. Different. It's not like that in all of the MSCs in Marine Forces Reserve, but that's how it was in the wing. So this kid, gets drunk, and I NJP him because he violated a lawful order, and he was one of the best Marines that I had in. I think he was a radioman. I can't remember, but it's not really important. But he was sort of a linchpin on the I&I staff, one of the few skilled in an area that was critical for our, effective operation. And the master guns came in and pleaded with me and, ma'am, please, he's young. He had a series of, broke up with his girlfriend, blah, had the whole sob story. And I was felt like I was really backed into a corner. I was like, master guns, it was a lawful order. It was a clear order. It was direct. And he broke it. What is my option here? So I essentially NJP'd him. As I recall, I suspended punishment, but then he went, I didn't restrict him, which I think is what they were asking me to do, like maybe just restrict him and not punish him. I let him participate in the comics because, well, A, we needed him, and B, I thought actually, he's young. This is going to be recoverable, right?
Right.
He was a good kid and good Marine, and he just blew it out of the park, man. Like he was the linchpin. Like I gave him a coin. He did fantastic in the comics. And so he recovered and he, went on to, finish out his enlistment and he did okay. So it was kind of an odd situation to where I had to make sure that people understood how serious I was about this issue, hold Marines accountable, but not crush them, especially when they're young and early on in their career. And I tell you, this is, I'm a mother. I have 3 girls that are now 18 and older. And so that perspective too, and dealing with young people, this age demographic for, 30 years now has informed how I look at the mistakes of young Marines. And I'm so glad that, he recovered. So
that's awesome. If we could stay on that
Yeah.
for a second, because I think you've got such a tremendous amount of experience, especially in the reserves, because my experience in the reserves was unique, but also not wholly indifferent from what a lot of other people's were. Was I didn't see a whole lot of disciplinary problems. Okay, maybe there were some times where there was a little bit too much drinking if we weren't in the field and we had a garrison weekend or something. Like, okay, so that, all right, fine. But for the most part, everybody wanted to be there. Everybody was excited about showing up and getting out of their civilian world for 2 or 3 days and yucking it up with the guys. And I didn't have women. It was still an artillery unit and they didn't have women yet. So guys, generically.
You weren't as good as you could have been, Dave.
I no, that is absolutely true. I 100% believe that to be true. I just was never given the opportunity. But the Marines all wanted to be there. So the things about like barracks fights and burning mattresses getting thrown off the third deck and all these crazy things, right? Like people running around with 12-pack boxes on their heads on a Friday night in the barracks. We didn't have that in the reserves. You showed up, you did your work, you had some fun. Maybe there was a little bit of tomfoolery going around that just that kind of stuff, but never the bad stuff. So I'm curious because you've got so much more experience than I do and you've seen so much more in the reserves. What are the common traits that derail leaders or cause them to fail inside the reserve structure? And you can even weave something in from active duty too, but I just feel like your experience in the reserves is probably a little bit more vast on that topic.
So we're extraordinarily fortunate to have some very talented men and women that want to lead in our formations. And that's really what it has to come down to. There are a lot of very talented women in the reserve component that don't want to lead because they don't think they can do it to the ability that they need to do it or want to do it because of their civilian work or their family or other life circumstances. But like on active duty in the reserve component, we select some really top-notch people and then leave a lot of good talent on the cutting room floor. I think where some people struggle
Hmm.
sometimes is if, and this doesn't happen very often, especially now, the integration with the active component and the divvying up of responsibilities, like whose unit is it? And infighting, if you will, inside the family between active component, reserve component,
Yeah.
that just creates hate and discontent inside the unit, and the unit doesn't function well when sort of mom and dad are fighting and the kids are left to fend for themselves. It shows through on, like, inspections. It shows through, when it comes time to activate or even, like, to go to annual training. Like, you can tell which organizations work well and which don't. But typically the reserve commanders and the command slated I&Is that go out, those teams are all very good. The hardest thing for the reserve leaders is the balance. Because I mean, I tell people all the time, like, the reserves has been really good to me, but I hate it. I hate it so much because built into the system is doing your job half-ass. It's built into the system, and we are not half-ass people as Marines. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're really only gonna get paid for part-time work. You can do a whole lot more than part-time work, but you're only gonna get paid for part-time work. But you see the scope of responsibility and the way you were brought up to want to do that job, and it is physically impossible. And by policy, it's
Yeah.
impossible. And so those sometimes those leaders either they give up too soon and we lose them, because they make a choice between what is it, I love the Marine Corps, but my job as a district attorney pays my bills and puts my kids through college, so I got to favor that.
Hmm.
So we lose good people, or they don't pay enough attention to the important things, those glass balls that they tell us, we have to juggle, and their units fail for whatever reason.
I have a follow-up question on that. Is the unique relationship that takes place between the I&I team and the reserve team, and I want to define that for listeners who may not know what we're talking about, but in a reserve unit, whether it's a company or a battalion or wherever there are leaders, there is in a unit, there is an inspector instructor staff. That's what the I&I means. And they're active duty Marines, and their job is to be in that reserve unit Monday through Friday. And then when the reservists come in for their drill weekend, to also participate in the drill weekend with them. Some of the Marines that are on that staff are what General Jackson just referred to as integrated, which means they're on the I&I staff, but when they drill, they're also in a billet that's part of that unit. And then there's an officer in charge, and there's usually at least a first sergeant, and then a sergeant major at the battalion level. And then on the reserve side, there's the commanding officer and the first sergeant. And those are the mom and dad that can start to argue. And so with that kind of context, I'm curious if you have some advice for either future I&I officers that are coming into the reserve system and have not done it before yet. So think like a captain going to a reserve unit at the company level, or an incoming reserve commander, on how to make that relationship work really well. What's a horror story and what's a success story look like based on your experience?
Okay. So first of all, I wanna do a pitch because I just talked to one of my outgoing I&Is, Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Gonzalez, CLB 23, fantastic officer. And she said to me, she said, ma'am, I didn't know what really I was getting into. I didn't know what I&I duty was. I thought I'd be stationed in New Orleans because it was the reserves, and she was up at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington. She said, "I didn't know what it was, but now," she said, "I just loved my time, it was a great, great tour." And I said, "Well, you need to go out and, spread the good news, spread the gospel, right, about I&I duty." And so I want those young captains out there to understand what a great deal it is. Like, it is if you think you can,
Hmm.
leading a company is challenging on Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton, when you've got your battalion structure maybe in the same building or right up the street from you, and that you can, bounce ideas off them, or, go see the CO about something, or, get the resources you need. Try doing that when your company commander or your battalion commander is 1,000 miles away in a different time zone. Are you up to that challenge?
Right.
Can you do that? And I think a lot of active duty Marines, like, don't think about that. You could be stationed, back home or close to home, and you can have some support for your family as, you go on exercise and things like that. It could be something totally new, and it's an amazingly challenging but rewarding job. I talk to, field grade officers all the time too, that I mentor all types, but field grades especially. And I said, hey, like my chief of staff, I have an active duty chief of staff at 4th MLG, active duty sergeant major at 4th MLG. And the sergeant major gets assigned and the chief gets assigned as well, and usually unwillingly, because they are in New Orleans and nobody, really wants to go there if they have a family, and there's a lot of different reasons. It is a great duty station, and the responsibility you get as a colonel there running, a logistics group or a Marine division while the CG is, almost always TAD. Imagine that responsibility and that scope that you don't get on the active side if you're an active duty MLG or division, whatever. So it's not for the faint of heart. And so I challenge those that might listen to this to see if they're up for that important work. When I walked into 4th Civil Affairs Group in Hialeah, Florida, I knew it was a different type of unit based on the office configuration of the commanding officer and the I&I, who shared an office, whose desks were side by side. And the message that sent, and I had 2 different I&Is, and they're both very different colonels, both excellent, both extreme professionals who ran their I&I staff and, therefore influenced how the CAG ran very, very well. But just that visual of having, okay, we're in this together. Like, this is not just my office. It's not just his office. Any phone calls he had while I'm on drill weekend are not secret. Any conversations he has, they're not secret. Same with me. We would welcome new joins together. We'd both, have our little spiel that we'd have for them. It was very much a united front at the top. And that made a huge difference. So it was really hard to do the us versus them with that type of scenario. And the majority of those billets were not integrated. So I didn't have very many of, quote, his Marines on my staff, if we were to deploy. But he sure ran it that way. All those Marines, they both understood what their function in life was. And I think some active component Marines get sent to I&I duty begrudgingly. And they, think, I got to train these nasty reservists who are, quote, part-time Marines, not understanding about the way the total force fights, not understanding the fact that every time the Marine Corps has gone to war in the last 100 years, it's gone to war with the Marine Corps Reserve, not understanding what we do for the total force and op-tempo relief and the way we train with, everybody in the joint force to make us more lethal, and not fully understanding the competency and professionalism and capability of the average reserve Marine. I had a sergeant who owned 5 restaurants. He was an admin clerk. I've had county judges as field grade officers, doctors, dentists, lawyers, plant managers that just love being Marines. And they come to work.
Yeah.
And they put on the uniform and they deal with all the BS and they do the annual training. By the way, we have to do all the same annual training the active component does in, 48 days out of the year. And I'm not complaining. It's just they don't understand when they get there. So it's easy for them. It's the historic us versus them, or the in-group versus the out-group that humanity has done since there was a humanity. And so it's a huge leadership challenge for those teams at whatever level they are to overcome that. And the best thing that you can do is to demonstrate you are shoulder to shoulder. You do speak with one voice. And we did that really, really well at 4th CAG. But I can't take credit. I walked into that scenario. And I hope it still is that way. I haven't been back to visit.
Did that unit used to be up in Washington, D.C.? Why do I feel like there was a CAG unit in D.C.?
Yeah,
it did,
yeah,
okay.
It was, yeah. And they moved it to, with Fist Rig back a few years ago, they moved it to just outside Miami.
Okay, gotcha. I thought that sounded familiar for a second. I agree with you. I think people who are getting an opportunity to get on an I&I staff off of active duty, here's my pitch for it too. It is a masterclass in negotiating, because you've got to figure out how to work together and negotiate, because there's 2 bosses there, right? There's the I&I officer one level above, and then there's a commanding officer one level above. And if you don't work together as a team, somebody's going to get their nose bent out of shape. And it was my time in the reserves. I never ended up in a battalion command in the reserves. So I tapped out at the battery level, but it was always the I would come to me, and I was a major, he was a captain, but he would say like, hey sir, if you do that, you're going to get me in trouble. Like, I'm going to hear about it. So can we chit chat about this before you go off and do that? And vice versa. I'd be like, hey, Chuck, I need the autonomy. I need you to convince your boss that we can do this. Like, if you can't get your boss on board, then my boss isn't going to get on board. And so I learned more about just the human element of teamwork and negotiating, because you don't, in the reserves and on I&I staff, nobody has the ability to slam their fist down on the table and say, this is the way it's going to be, unless they're the brigadier general in charge of.
And then we get smacked down by the 3-star that says,
exactly.
You don't have the authority to make that decision. Yeah.
Right. There's always somebody with the smackdown authority. But that negotiation is always taking place. And I learned a lot about just teamwork and dealing with people, because I'd never had the ultimate authority to say, like, I'm the commanding officer and this is the way it's going to happen. And neither did he. So it was sort of interesting. I think you're right. I think the opportunity to go be an I&I is a great opportunity to just take a little bit of a break. You get the comp days after drill weekends, and you don't really deal with a whole lot of the problems because they don't show up. Here's the other story I like to tell about the reserves too. And I'm just going to take a quick commercial here, but my artillery battery would go from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And it was a 5-hour road march up a highway. I don't remember what the highway number was, but there was an interchange through Nashville that we had to go through. And so when we went to the field to shoot artillery, we're rolling 30 pieces of rolling stock, 5 hours up the road with maybe a wrecker if it was working and a refueler.
I hope.
And we would stop off at some big truck stop kind of thing. And we ran like probably an illegal refueling spot on the side of the road and refueled all the vehicles. And we went up, and then we would shoot artillery, and then we would clean up all of our stuff, and then we'd road march back 5 hours. And you think about active duty, if I walked into my battalion commander's office on active duty and said, I'm going to go ahead and get the Marines together at 04 on Friday morning, we're going to stage all the gear, and then we're going to drive from Camp Pendleton up to 29 Palms all by myself. Then we're going to shoot artillery for a couple of days, and then I'm going to come back down another 5-hour road march. I'll be back by Sunday night. Is that cool with you? The answer would be absolutely no across the board. Whereas it was just, you just did it in the reserves because you had that truncated time. You don't have time to mess around. Like you were talking about the annual requirements, going to the rifle range is 1 day, not a week.
Yeah. I mean, you better be, and you probably haven't handled the rifle in a year, or maybe last drill, you took it out of the armory and you CLP'd it and then you put it back, and then you touch it again and you're expected to qualify,
And by the way, for promotion score, I mean, it's here are your 5 rounds of zero your weapon, and we'll see you on the 200-yard line. So, but I agree with you. I think the opportunity to do an I&I or even a direct affiliation out of the active duty is huge. But sorry, I didn't want to turn this into a commercial about the reserves. But
no, that's okay.
Getting back to the evaluations, like the evaluating people, like evaluations and promotions. I mean, we have this system where it really kind of relies on the fitness report and relies on the opinion of your boss and their boss and the RSRO structure. But is that an effective way to promote the best? And if you think it is, great, we can move on to the next question. If it's not, I'm kind of curious what sort of creative things you can think of that leaders should be doing to evaluate either their own performance or other Marines' performance in addition to the fitness report system.
Yeah, and I will say just quickly on the fitness report system, my understanding is that we're moving to the 360 look for the fitness report. Great. Yeah. So it's 360 evaluation where you have seniors, subordinates, and sort of contemporaries that weigh in on your evaluation. It hasn't been rolled out yet. I think they've done a couple pilots on it. I don't know too much more about it, but my understanding is that we are moving in that direction, and I think that's a good thing. I did one as part of the Army War College years ago when I did it, and it was enlightening. The things that I thought I was pretty good at, there wasn't unanimous consent on that, but it was intense. It was like 100 questions, which, I mean, that's a lot. So I hope they've scaled down. Yeah. To answer 100 questions about somebody. And I think they're trying to, get consistency and filter out, snap judgments or whatever, but I'm not sure what it looks like now, but it was enlightening, for me, because at that point, I was a lieutenant colonel. I was actually in my 05 command when I did Army War College. It's a oddity of the reserves where you're going to be doing those two things at exactly the same time. So that was super challenging, but it was good. And I think our system has gotten pretty good about weeding out toxic leaders. But every once in a while now they still kind of pop through and you might shake your head
Uh-huh.
when you see it and you're like, how did that person get promoted or get command or whatever? And I think it's because, they look really, really good. The expression I think is most helpful is, it's a monkey in a tree kind of thing. When you're looking down at a monkey who's in a tree, they're all smiles, right? And they look great. But
Yeah.
if you're below the monkey and you're looking up, it's a different look, right?
Yeah.
And we have some of those monkeys that are in the trees sometimes. A lot of them are gone. A lot of them they have filtered out or retired or whatever, which I'm so grateful for. Our service has moved in that direction. But yeah, you don't get a complete look at how a leader is when it's just going off of the fit rep at all.
Yeah.
It's good, but it's not as good as it could be. And I think now is the opportunity to probably leverage technology and get more of a holistic look on the leader that's in that position.
Yeah. I mean, you and I were talking about officer candidate school early on in the episode, and it just dawned on me. I mean, we used to do the peer evaluations. Remember
Yeah,
the spear evaluations we would
spear
call them?
eval.
Spear
Yeah,
evaluations, right.
yeah,
And all you did was you said, okay, I got 13 people in my squad, and you had to rank them 1 through 13. And I think you had to give a justification why the top 3 and the bottom 3. But I mean, 360 reviews have been around in very unsophisticated forms for a long time. And so it's funny to me that they're meaningful at OCS, they're meaningful at TBS, but then they're not meaningful out in the fleet. And I think the 360 thing could be I look at it as a great way for people to understand where they could be better. And that the civilian world uses them a lot. And again, it's
yeah,
kind of like it should be a no recourse kind of thing, but people can actually do them themselves if they want to. But, you know,
yeah. Know thyself and seek self improvement. Like that never gets old, and
hmm
it's applicable in any type of job that you might have. If you don't really know yourself, then I don't see how you can continue to grow and improve. And if
yeah,
you're lying to yourself, then chances are you're not very good in leading people. But I was just going to share too. It just made me think of some of the ways I've survived as a leader when I wasn't the smartest person in the room, which has been in almost every single billet I've ever been in. But a tactic I used at Com Squadron that worked really well. I had been out of com for a while, and so I had last been in a com billet honestly in 1997, and then I was briefly on the 2MEF G6 staff several years later before I got picked up for command in 2013. And so a lot had changed in the technology world since I had last done my deep dive and lived the comm life. But I used to sit around the table and, we'd go to get ready to go to the field, have a confirmation brief or whatever. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, I don't even know what all this equipment does yet. Like, I'm still learning that. But I would ask questions like, okay, what am I missing? What am I not seeing here? Yeah, or I'd look especially at my LDOs, my limited duty officers, that were, captains usually had been gunnery sergeants and had been around for a minute. And I'd say, what worries you about this? And after a minute, they'd look at me like, dear God, do I actually say it? Do I say what's on my mind? And then I'd encourage them to say it. Like, tell me, we got again, it's in the reserves, like, especially, we don't have a lot of time to screw this up. This is our one shot to make this work. So if you're concerned about something, tell me and tell it so everybody can hear. That really encouraged them to be more collaborative on the front end of things because they knew that I was going to ask those questions and they wanted to have all those things ironed out ahead of time. And you didn't want to surprise, the senior leaders or the officers who had planned it if that was the first time they were hearing it. But it also reinforced to them, like, okay, like I'm not here to be the smartest commo in the room. And again, the lieutenants at the platoon level, you're not the best infantry officer or the best artillery. Like there's a lot to learn there, but you are there to lead, and that's what they needed me to do there. And so it was a delicate balance to say I'm not going to embarrass myself by showing how much I don't know, but I want to be collaborative in this decision making and let you have your say as to how you think this thing that you've worked on that I'm now responsible for making sure it gets executed. You have a piece to that. without making
Yeah.
myself feel like I'm showing my butt, so to speak.
That's great advice for
It's a
everybody.
useful tool. Yeah, it's a useful tool. And I think I just developed it out of desperation because I knew there was so much I didn't know
Yeah.
those units especially.
But I mean, but that applies to almost every level. I mean, you walk in as a second lieutenant, you don't know what's going on. You're a brand new general officer. I don't know. I just feel like there's
Yeah.
always points in your life where where you don't always know what's going on. I'm sure the commandant sits and sometimes it's like, I don't really understand what everybody's talking about. I mean, there's just no way everybody can know everything about but that's the power
Yeah.
of the team, right?
Right.
That's the power of it all, is that you need to be able to listen to the experts and make a good decision, gather the information. But I think that's great advice. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
It's sticking on this topic because I'm really enjoying this. If you were to look back through your lens as a general officer now, do you see any sort of conventional leadership wisdom that you see as being flawed now from your perspective down through your filter?
Yeah, I'll say the one that, and this one kind of bit me in the butt too when I was an '05 commander. The whole idea of having a bias for action,
Huh.
that mostly holds true. But as an officer, and especially the more authority and responsibility you have, especially over the direction of people's careers and lives and all that, you have to know when to slow down. And you have to understand how much time you actually have to make a decision. And that taking all of the time that you have to make a decision is okay and probably the right thing to do. It was Einstein, what's his famous saying that if he had an hour to make a really critical decision, he would take 55 minutes to frame the problem and do the research and then take the last 5 minutes to think about his decision. I got into an issue when I was an '05 commander. I had my first congruent. It's been my only congruent to date, knock on wood. My first congruent though, and it was a gunny who I had NJP'd, who, I mean, for a lot of good reasons, deserved the punishment that he got. But in the paperwork that we got from the site support out in Miramar, it had some old language in there that was sort of like a template that they never like lined through or crossed out. And anyway, the language in there was that, he was on restriction. Like I didn't want to take his pay because he had kids and, so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna just restrict this guy to the barracks and, for 2 weeks or whatever. There wasn't a whole lot I could do to him, but I needed to make a point. So I restricted him but it only allowed him 10 minutes of time with his family, like maybe a week. It was something really crazy, like he was imprisoned. And, his wife raised hell about that, justifiably so. But what I had done was I didn't read the whole thing before I signed it. I was literally jumping in my car, trying to make a flight, leaving drill, and someone shoved the paper in front of me like, ma'am, here's the paperwork for the gunny. And I just kind of quick scan and then sign it. I did not read it in detail. It was pretty rough for a while trying to answer the mail on that. And my group leadership was not pleased with me or my staff for letting that slip through. But I have since learned to ask my staff how much time I have to make a decision and for them to tell me and preface things like, ma'am, I don't need a decision on this right now, but by Friday, I'm going to come back to you and ask you what you think about this. Or, ma'am, I'm sorry, this is really hot. If you have 10 minutes, I'll sit down with you. I can go over this with you or leave this with you so you can read it. But to understand how much time you have to make a decision. And so I think as we're young officers and they say, you're going to have to make decisions like very quickly in the heat of the moment. That is true sometimes. That's not always true, especially for like routine admin things or when you're not in combat, really, and bullets aren't flying or people aren't bleeding out. Like that's true. You want to be able to train yourself to take in a lot of information, leverage your experience, and make the right decision at the right time and not sit on your hands because that's not what Marines do. We move out, we do something. But as a senior leader, that doing something is no substitute for fully understanding the problem and the gravity of the decision you're about to make and then making a fully informed decision and taking the time you need to do that. And so when I hear bias for action, I kind of bristle now if the context isn't right.
That's awesome. That may be the best segment of the whole podcast. I mean, everybody should rewind that and listen to it again.
All right, Dave. See you later. It was good. It's fun.
No, I just mean that was really great. I like that a lot. What rank were you when you figured that out? General, or did you start to figure it out earlier?
Yeah, lieutenant colonel. Like so when you have to when you're sitting with your first or your sergeant major going, "Welp, it was a good career. I'm not sure we're going to survive this." It kind of rang home that this is something pretty serious. Like I got to learn when to slow down. And so I really like that after I realized kind of what had happened, I had to sit down with my staff like, "Okay, please help me." Especially in this crazy reserve world where you do have to move 100 miles an hour because you have such limited time, so few touch points with everybody. You want to make decisions to move the ball forward and especially give, good intent so that when you're not there, your staff can continue to do what they have to do. And so you don't want to be seen as dithering. Nobody wants that,
Yeah.
especially Marines. But there are a lot of circumstances where you don't have to make a snap decision. So my take is you shouldn't. So that really came home to roost when I was a lieutenant colonel. I've only stayed on that track since.
So, unscripted question here, but is there a difference between being a lieutenant colonel and having essentially that's the first time as an officer you have a staff? I think, right? I mean, you don't have a staff at the company level. So you have a staff. What progressively changes as a leader as you move up in structure and continue to have a staff? So in other words, your staff now as the MLG commander is way different than the staff that you had at the battalion level. There's similarities. If you look back through that, what are some lessons learned or advice that you have for people as they start progressing up to bigger and bigger staffs? Is there a theme of lesson there? Because at your level, you've got a lot of colonels, I'm assuming, on your staff. At least 3 or 4, right?
Like full board colonels, like my chief and my 3 are full board colonels, and I have some reserve staff members that are colonels as well. And my deputy commander is a colonel. Yeah. So, and then my regimental commanders are, as well. So, I would say not to lose your humanity in your effort to do good staff work.
Right.
That's any job you're in, military or civilian. Making sure you're preparing whatever document for the boss in such a way that the boss can make a good decision on it. So kind of anticipating those questions that he or she might ask and doing a lot of the legwork ahead of time. But in the meantime, you don't want to alienate the subordinate unit or the staff section that may have also contributed to that product as well. I know that's kind of vague, but I'm just thinking of times where, you might have a package that needs to get approved and somebody along the chain disagrees with it and says, "I don't think this should get approved." Well, I think the responsible thing to do is that person calls the originator of the package and says, "Hey, I have a propensity to disapprove this. Can you tell me why you think? Can you give me more context to help me make my decision so that when the CG sees that, everybody agreed, but the four disagreed. Why is that? There's not this big discussion and all that homework's been done." That gets more and more important the more senior staff because of the volume and because of the gravity and importance of those decisions that the CG is getting.
Plus, your staff is comprised of colonels and lieutenant colonels. So I'm going to say on the officer side and the enlisted side, you're probably dealing with a lot of people who are close to or exceeding 20 years of experience.
Yes.
Whereas at the battalion, you've got a couple majors and some master sergeants and gunnies, and you're dealing with like 10 years of experience. So there must be a whole different level of staff. I'm going to use the word behavior, but it's not exactly the right word, but like culture or your expectations of them must be radically different. You're probably, well, I don't know. Are you mentoring your staff at that point? Or are you just saying like, "Hey, you got 25 years and you should know how to do this, like get it done," versus if you're a battalion commander, you're mentoring majors.
Yeah. At those lower levels, you definitely are. And you want to, like, I'm a big, a grammar person, if you will. Like I hate to have, I won't forward up a document that is grammatically incorrect or has errors on it or it's the wrong format. Like I simply won't do it. And it makes me crazy when I receive stuff like that. I don't want to say I was more tolerant when I was a younger commander, but I expected it more and I saw it more. And again, it's because of the experience level of the person that is handing me that document or preparing that brief for me. I expect to see that less now. And again, I'm very blessed, very fortunate. I do see it less. The products that I get are usually really, really good. And I tell all my staffs that I have a keen eye for grammar and spelling and, mismatched font and all those things. Because to me, that means, especially now with all the technology tools, like if you don't care enough to show me a product or have me, sign off on a product that I'm going to send to the boss that is grammatically correct, what else don't you care about that's in this document? Have you cut corners somewhere in the staff work? Like what else is missing here? So that to me is an indicator. It may not be the case, but that's how my brain works. What else don't you care about? Because the computer is
Right.
telling you that word is already spelled wrong, 9 times out of 10. Anyway, that's me. That when I have my sit downs with my new staffs and I kind of go over, my leadership philosophy, and I like to tell them my story, to tell them where I've been, and give them an idea of how I think, and that helps them operate when I'm not there, which in the reserves is all the time. So that there's no mystery about like what does the CG care about, or what does the CO care about? Why does she think this way about this particular thing? Like, what is it in her background? And so that if I'm not there, they can go, okay, I know CG probably wouldn't like the fact that we're going to, have all the lieutenants, give a lecture on the difference between bit and baud because she had that story in her background. You know what I mean? Well, now
Yeah,
it's the
right.
now it's the logistics group. So, the differences between TAC log and op log and, all those things that I probably should be giving that lecture because I'm still learning as well. But they know that about me. They know those things about me. So especially if I've told you, yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit more annoyed if I continue to see it in documents. But I think it's just part about being a professional, and no matter what organization you're in, and caring about the work that you give to somebody else that represents what you've just done.
Right. I have a question about mentoring as it relates to females. So, where did you receive your mentoring from? Because I got to imagine that the volume of senior female officers was pretty low above you relative to the men, right? I mean, it's just more men than women. So, where were you getting your mentoring from? And then, how do you do your mentoring down to other women and or men? Is it different between the genders? And is the mentoring that you've received been different from the genders?
I did not work for a senior female officer until I had 25 years in the Marine Corps and I was a senior colonel. I have worked
Okay.
for men almost exclusively until I worked for General Reynolds at DCI when she's the deputy commandant for information. And I was a reservist on her staff. 25 years in the Marine Corps at that point, senior colonel. So who mentored me? Men mentored me.
Yeah.
And really the detachment commander after the detachment commander that maybe do the presentation couldn't have been more different than the first guy. And this guy's name is Medio Monti. And I owe him a lot because he sort of rekindled my desire to to be a Marine, stay a Marine, relit the fire, if you will, about leadership and how special it was. And he was always happy. He was always motivated. And he showed all of us lieutenants, he sort of like breathed life back into the organization. And so he, as a young lieutenant, was really my first mentor that had a lot of impact on my professional development. And I've just had some really good men along the way that have cared about me enough to invest in me and, help me see where my strengths are and where my weaknesses were and, how I could be a better version of myself. And then there's my friends. So especially of course, my guy friends, but my female friends too, especially the ones that were a little bit ahead of me on the family front. And so here I think of like Sarah Fullwood, who probably was about 18
Oh, I
months
know
senior.
Sarah Fullwood.
Do you? She's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Well, I know her husband Jim really well.
Sarah is amazing. Jim is pretty cool. Sarah is very cool.
I think he would
Yeah.
agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he would. He would, I know. But Sarah got out and went into the reserves and was pregnant with
Mm-hmm.
her oldest son right after I had done the same thing. And first of all, I had never ever seen a pregnant officer in the Marine Corps ever. So when I got pregnant with my first, I was like, well, here I go. I get off, get off active duty because I don't know how you do this on active duty. It was not done as an officer. And I watched Sarah participate in the reserves because when I got off active duty, I was in the IRR. I wanted nothing to do with the Marine Corps in 1999. I was bitter and angry and pregnant, which is not a good combination. And my husband was deployed, also not a good combination. And I watched her.
Oof.
Have a reserve career, have that baby, do stuff around the house, do work. And I was like, how is she doing that? And so we would talk all the time. And I would call her and, we didn't text back then. I'd call her or I'd walk to her house and be like, how do you do this? And so I've had relationships like that, throughout my career. And now I see as a civilian, I work at Marine Corps University and I see these majors, these captains and majors, lieutenant colonels come through and a lot of them are married and have multiple kids and have stayed on active duty. And I'm just so impressed and so in awe of them that they've been able to do this and with their spouses, because it's certainly not possible without a supportive spouse at all. So they figured it out, and I'm really proud of them.
Thanks for that answer about the mentoring. And that makes total sense that friends become mentors. I had very similar thing. I mean, my friend group, you met a bunch of them at Lieutenant General Bell in retirement, but we were just ruthlessly accountable to each other for standards. And that's kind of where the mentoring came for me too. But you said something that I want to spend a little bit more time on, which was, all men were mentoring you. Now, if I think about statistically the amount of men and women in the Marine Corps, that's probably not going to change anytime soon, if ever. And so I think there will always be men mentoring women to a greater extent than there are women mentoring men. I think just statistically, it just makes sense to me. So I'm asking the question from the standpoint of what advice do you have for men who are mentoring women?
I think for any mentor, and this is like anybody, even if you're a parent, taking away that propensity to say, well, I did it this way, you should do it this way too, or I did it and so can you,
Okay.
Yeah. Or, a man might say, well, my wife did this, so surely you can do this. My wife had 3 kids and still ran, 3 marathons a year. I don't understand why you're on light duty and can't do a PFT. Just to understand that everybody is different. Everybody has obviously different body, a different background, different experience. And so is to not go down that road. You can use your own experience as an example, but don't pretend to understand where that person sits or stands because your wife or your female friend or whatever, had an experience that maybe rhymes with what that person is going through. But also to understand that, and this goes for anybody too, it's not the gender thing sometimes is difficult because sometimes people make it a thing when it doesn't need to be a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's okay to be you and to want certain things out of your career, to ask for those things. And if they don't happen, to understand the Marine Corps can't lose. The Marine Corps has to continue on. And so everyone's not going to get what they want, but it won't know to try unless you ask for those things that you want. And maybe it's that women tend to be, and I've seen this in both the civilian side and the military side, a little less self-promoting. And not that men are self-promoting, but they will talk openly about their achievements and say, I've done this, that, and the other thing. And women tend to be a little bit more like, well, we did this, we did that. When I was there, we did, you know what I mean? Guys are just very matter of fact. Nope, I was the leader. This is what I did. This is what, the team, whatever it is, but they can talk about their achievements a little bit easier than women can. And so maybe it's just coaching women on talking about what their roles have been at the places where they have served, and maybe even some of the intangibles that they bring to the table that men don't, and not through any fault of their own. It's just that men and women are different. I'll give you an example of one of those things. It's back to India 323. We had an admin chief it was my husband's admin chief, and I was there once a week. I drilled like every Monday from 08 to 12. And then I went and picked up the kids and, so that was my schedule. But his admin chief was having some family problems. I don't, it's immaterial what they were. At the same time, my husband's complaining about, hey, he's disorganized. He's not been on time. I don't know what's going on with him. And he and I are getting ready to have a hard conversation, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, hey, did you know that he's been having some family troubles? And he's like, no. He said, First Sergeant didn't tell me anything about that. I said, I don't know. First Sergeant knows. I said, I just had a conversation with him, after the staff meeting, whatever it was. And I don't know why I even asked him. But no, he felt comfortable telling me, but it was, it was just a different approach. And I've had that happen to me time and time again. Yeah. So I would just say, make no assumptions. Don't draw parallels that, are false parallels between people's careers or desires, but just help them really recognize what the value they bring to the service itself, and then not to be afraid to talk about that.
Thanks for that. Because I'll say that I have these two different reactions and you're my first female guest. So I feel like I'm on eggshells sometimes when I ask questions, because it's like, well, is gender an issue? Maybe I shouldn't even ask the question, because your answer could be like, you just treat me like you treat every other Marine. And that could have been your answer. Or it could have been like along the lines of what you said. And so it's hard because there's great questions and there's great things to address. And then on the other side of it, it's, well, maybe there shouldn't be any. I think there is. I think it's just natural. We all grow up with, people in our lives and have different relationships with them. And so I think that recognizing it and having the opportunity to mentor men and women as both men and women is extremely enriching from a leadership perspective, and also extremely important to somebody's professional growth. And you kind of hit on this. I'm going to say something you didn't say, but I think this is what you were trying to say too, which is, I think that's why the diversity in the force is so important. So I think back when I was in my battery, we didn't have women in combat units yet. And I think to myself, how much more would I have been aware of issues going on in my battery if there were other people there that could have been sounding boards for people, or somebody else that would have been more approachable to talk to about things? I mean, I'll never know, but
I remember this in my 06 command too, where my chief went from being male to being female. And all of a sudden my Navy chief, the only like full-time medical person I had on my staff, she was like a counselor to people. They would just talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
The guys would just talk to her. And so she might be like wrapping their sprained ankle, and all of a sudden she's like, wow, I'm sorry you're going through a divorce. Like they would just feel free to talk to her. And that's just human nature,
I want to ask you a question about Brigadier General. So when you transitioned from colonel to general, what was that transition like? Because from my perspective, as somebody who retired as a lieutenant colonel, I look at the difference between a colonel and a general like the Grand Canyon. Maybe that's just my perspective on things, but it seems like such a big leap. Like, you're a general. What was that transition like? And was it really no more difficult than going from lieutenant colonel to colonel, or major to lieutenant colonel? Or is there really a big gap there? Did you jump a big gap in that transit? What was that like?
I think there actually is a pretty big gap, and it's not, you don't really realize it at first. And I will tell you just a quick story. My first GO job, I was the DCG, Deputy Commanding General at 2MEF on the reserve side. So there was an active duty DCG,
Okay.
Friend of mine, BG SOC classmate of mine, Drew Pretty, and then me. So I wasn't at 2MEF all the time, but I was down there, and I had an interest in the relatively new organization called the MIG. Because of my time at DCI, I was a commo, civil affairs officer, 2 information MOSs. I wanted to see what the MIG was doing. And so I emailed the CO and I said, hey, I'd like to come over. I'm going to be down there these days, whatever. So he's walking me around, and I'm like, my God, it smells really clean in here. Like, everywhere we went, I'm like, wow, you guys, this is all spick and span. You really, like, these facilities are really, really nice, very clean. And obviously the Marines care about, like, where they work. And every room I went into, I was mentioning how clean it was and how it smelled. And he stops me, this colonel, and he goes, geez, ma'am, it's almost as if we were having a special visitor today. And I was like,
Oh, gee.
holy crap. Oh my God, you
Oh,
cleaned for
that's
me.
funny.
I had I had never had someone clean for me, even very rarely at home. Like I'm the one who does the cleaning usually. Yeah, so that was a realization to me. And that also, like, when I would say things, people took out their notebooks and would write stuff down. As a colonel, you're like, okay, I could probably I got it. I can remember, but like people want to get your words right when you say things as a
Mhm.
GO. So it reinforced to me like, okay, don't think out loud. And if you do need to think out loud because you're problem solving with a small group, say things like, I'm thinking out loud right now. I'm not making a decision, to have people understand your thought process, but that your words really have meaning. And people remember the words that you say or that you write to them, and they will tell you about it and will stick with them. And, I learned, again, this is as no 5 commander, I wanted to know like birthdays and unfortunately any deaths or like big occasions and I would handwrite notes. And I still have people come up to me from that unit that say, ma'am, I was a brand new sergeant. I just had a baby and you wrote my wife and I a letter and it was just so great. And I'll always remember that, all the way up to the words that I wrote to a chief warrant officer who lost his daughter while she was in college, and then extraordinarily thoughtful email that he sent back to me saying, I received your letter and my wife and I are so appreciative and words mean more than you could know. And on like that. So the impact of your words and making sure that that aligns with the intent of those words, and that's a leadership lesson that I think everybody needs to be aware of and think about is that what your intent is and what the actual impact is of either your thoughts or your actions or your words, and make sure that they align. Because so many times as leaders, we will say things with a certain intention or do things, and that's not the effect they have down the line or downrange or, 2 formations down, just to make sure that those things align. And just because you had a certain intention, if it didn't work out the way you thought, that it doesn't matter if your intention was a good intention, you have to deal with the impact of those thoughts or
Yeah.
words. So just something to keep in mind. And that's another thing, just being so careful about how you share what's in your head. And not that you are risk averse, because I think we've had conversation about this at some point, but that you understand that your words have a great deal of gravitas now, and what you say matters a lot just to most people.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, you're right. You're right. 2 more questions before we wrap up. So you did a joint tour. I'm curious if you have any lessons learned or were there any formative moments in leadership coming off of a joint tour, because reserve Marine drilling, very Marine Corps centric. And then I'm just going to assume it was the first time you ever did something joint. I don't recall in your bio if you had done anything prior to that, but tell me about the joint tour.
So I had just done school joint. So Army War College, and then
Okay.
the Joint and Combined Warfare School, is joint, obviously. But I had never been in a joint formation. When I was a lieutenant, I went to Peru. I worked out of the embassy. That was joint. So that was actually a good sort of formative experience to understand how the joint force works or doesn't work together. But compare and contrast from the 90s, all the way forward to the, 2023 when I was out at Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa last year. Yeah, it was an amazing experience. I have an immense appreciation for the joint force and what each element or component brings to the joint force, because there we had active duty, we had reserve, and we had National Guard. And so people that were coming from all different experiences and backgrounds and coming together to work on this, super important mission there. And what we now know is a critical, maritime strait area, but key piece of terrain. We knew it was when we were there, but I think as people especially know where the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is now, based on what's happening in the world today. But it was an amazing experience. But yeah, it did also underline to me and emphasize to me that Marines are different. Everybody has their strengths as a service, but it made me just immensely proud to be a Marine And it was really gratifying for me to see that I could have that impact on the staff and bring some of the cultural things from the Corps, to the other services and say, okay, this is how we do things, but this is why we do things. And while I'm here, this is how we're going to do it because this is how I'm comfortable doing it. And then when you get a new DCG, you can do it his or her way, but this is how I do it. And so there's a little bit of training involved, and training that went both ways too. Like I had a
Yep.
whole new vernacular I had to learn, dealing with the Army mostly. My aide was a National Guard, Army National Guard officer. He was fantastic, but there was just learning that had to occur on both sides. You can't make any assumptions, that's for sure. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was a great experience, and while it underlined for me how incredible of a service that we have, and that all of our training works. The Kool-Aid that we make and we drink and we drink with our fellow Marines is pretty good for you. That doesn't mean the other services are terrible at all by any stretch. There's some amazing people in our joint force, and that's how we're going to fight, and that's how we'll win. So I came away encouraged by that tour.
Yeah, that we can still have great people in the other services, and they just don't have
Yeah.
as good at uniforms as us. I mean, that's just a fact.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
So bonus question, and then I want to wrap up with an opportunity to say something about the direct affiliation program. So from your experience, can you give some advice to the upcoming sergeants major who are transcending up into billets that are moving from, say, a regimental level and into a sergeant major job with a general officer? What is that progression look like for them? What is the step up that they need to get ready for that they haven't had experience with in previous smaller commands?
Probably the biggest sort of immediate hurdle they're going to have to overcome is how busy that general officer is and how much they're away. And so not just in the reserve context like I am. So my sergeant major, as I mentioned, is active duty, and he's there day on, stay on with my active duty chief. I'm gone most of the time, and we come together, usually when we travel or if I'm in New Orleans. But even on the active side, that general officer is pulled in so many different directions that there's has to be a deliberate effort to have time with a commanding general and to make sure that you understand the way they think and his or her intent, because you will be one of those people that the staff will look to and say, well, what's the boss think about this? And they have to be able to answer, and say, well, we've talked about that and this was the discussion, or say, I know that you want to make a decision about this right now, but I really think the boss needs to weigh in on this based on X. And operating alone and unafraid, if you will, a lot, because that CG is just gone a great deal of time. I think is different from the way they are accustomed to operating, which is probably shoulder to shoulder with that colonel. Wherever the CO goes, I go, and we're a team, and that's how I like to operate. When I go out to the units, I like to have both the sergeant major and the command master chief with me. Anytime I go somewhere, I'm lucky enough to have a command master chief. And I don't feel quite right if I don't have one of them or both of them, especially.
Mhm.
But that's just not reality most of the time at that level now. So both parties need to make a deliberate effort, but I would say the sergeant major especially, to remind that CG, like, hey sir or ma'am, can I have 10 minutes with you, and let's just talk through a couple things and let you know what I'm dealing with some of the senior enlisted or whatever. That is invaluable, because you're going to have to be carrying the water for the commander alone a lot.
Follow-up question on that. What does an officer coming in to become an aide for a general officer need to know that they may not instinctively know based on their experience? And you're smiling for people who are just listening to this because you can't see that you're smiling. Maybe
I'm
I should ask that
smiling.
question with an hour left to go. Right. Yeah. Yes.
No, I'll just quickly say is that generally we do a very good job selecting the aides, but there's no aide school. None of the services really, as far as I know, have an aide school. You may or may not get a list of things that will, don't do this as an aide and do this as an aide, or you might get a turnover from the last aide that tells you this is how the boss likes to do things or not do things. But then the aides, they change out. Usually they're only positioned for about a year. There are a ton of things, especially in the Marine Corps, because I think we take the strictest interpretation of what an aide can and can't do for the commander who they help, who they're the aide for. There are a lot of things that they would like to do that fall into the category of like personal servitude. Quick example, when I showed up in Africa and I was going to one of my first staff meetings, I had been running around like a nut, and I show up at the conference room, and right at my place is a brand new, it's a cup, one of those great coffee cups, right? And it says DCG, and it's engraved, and it's a present from the CG, which is totally fine. But in that cup is some hot black coffee. And I'm like, okay, this is awkward because the staff's around the table. I'm like, not going to call out my aide for getting me coffee. So after the fact, I'm like, hey, where'd that coffee come from? And he's like, oh man, he's so proud of himself. Oh man, I took this as a gift from the CG, and I thought I knew you liked black coffee, so I just filled it with black coffee and I just put it there for you so you could have it during the meeting. And I said, don't you ever do that again. I can get my own coffee. I need to get my own coffee. You can't get my coffee for me. Now, I think the other services probably there's a different interpretation of that in some places. Mm-hmm. But at BGSOC, our charm school for GOs, like they scare us to death about the things that are going to get you in trouble about what you do or don't do with your aide. And that was certainly one of them, the personal servitude piece. So both my aides that I've had have struggled with things that they want to do for me because they want to be helpful and take things off my plate that I could not let them do. That's just one of those things. So new aides need to ask, like, what can I do and what can't I do? Like, what's going to get you in trouble, ma'am or sir, even though that's not my intent, so there's probably more advice. Things that they can't. Yeah.
So as a very long serving reserve officer, I want to wrap up on just the opportunity to talk to listeners about the opportunity that exists in the reserves for people who are on active duty, the direct affiliation program, the opportunity that exists there. Quick commercial for that. I feel like it's not very well understood, and this is a great platform to get the word out to people about what the benefits are of considering direct affiliation for people getting off active duty.
Yeah, there are a variety of reasons why people get off active duty. I think we generally do a poor job in telling them what opportunities are to continue to serve because most people think it's either active duty or it's nothing. That's the only way to be a Marine. And I mentioned earlier, it's hard to be a part-time Marine, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what service in the reserve actually means. And for those that are leaving the active component because of things like op tempo or time away from family or, hey, I did what I wanted to do and now I want to start a civilian career. And they don't understand that they can do all those things that they want to do on the outside and still be in uniform and still contribute and have a meaningful role in the national security, of our country in arguably the most dangerous time that anyone's seen in a generation or two, right? That they can do that in the reserves. They can do that probably in a place close to where they live, especially if you're on the enlisted side. And if you're an officer, it also can be a place or a unit that allows you to retrain into an MOS that you don't have on the active side. The enlisted can do that as well. You can change MOSs. You have to go to school and do that.
But you can move. Yeah.
You can lat move. You can reinvent yourself. You can have a different career track. And I mean, I did that. And that's one of the reasons if I had just stayed calm, it was a means to an end for me. I don't love it. I loved civil affairs. Like that was more my jam. And now I'm the CG of a logistics group. I'd never even served in the MLG before. Like the reserve career can be a lot of different things. And you have a lot of leeway to still have a civilian career, to still be present for your kids' baseball games and recitals and graduations and all of that, and still be in uniform. And there are many ways to do that. You can be in a traditional reserve unit, like operational reserve, a battalion, a squadron, a group, whatever, or you can be part of what's called an, IMA detachment, individual mobilization augmentee. That's the reserve staff of almost every active component unit we have. I did a lot of time in that, especially when my kids were young, because it was flexible. And so wherever my husband landed as an active duty Marine, I would find an IMA job to do that. And I would work, I'd work out my work schedule, my drill schedule with the unit I was supporting. So there's a lot of flexibility to still serve in uniform and to do some really meaningful work that is more aligned with maybe, what you're good at or what your interests are. So the fact is we just need really good people to consider all of the options when they leave active duty, because we need you in the reserve component. We need your experience. We need your, love of the service and love of the Marines, because whether you realize it or not, I had someone say this to me not too long ago, and it really rings true. It's like when they're retired and they said, I don't miss the circus, but I miss the clowns. And that's what it is.
I hear that a lot. It's true.
You miss the Marines, and this gives you that little monthly inject of being around Marines, all walks of life, and sort of reinvigorating, reigniting that fire that made you want to become a Marine in the first place, especially as a Marine officer, made you want to lead Marines in the first place. It's just, you can see I'm struggling for words. Like there's so many intangibles that it's difficult. You don't get paid always for the work that you do, the more senior you get, but I would not trade it for the world. It's an incredible opportunity.
I had the same experience. I lat moved MOSs coming into the reserves. I became a tanker, and that let me go over to the LAR community. And then I went back to the artillery community, and I did an IMADET at the old Division of Public Affairs, and had a great time doing that. You're right. You can flex. When I was on the IMADET, I did all my drills in the summer between June and August, and I was done for the rest of the year. So I had to run a PFT, CFT, and do all these drills. And basically I would go on not active duty, but I'd go to work every single day for Monday through Friday. And I got all my drills satisfied, and I was done. And it was fantastic. I had the whole rest of the year off to grow my hair, not shave, do whatever I want to do.
Right.
Or, business stuff and things like that. But it's fantastic. Now, Major General Bowers won't appreciate this slogan that I have, but I like to say it's all the cool shit without a lot of the bullshit. That's kind of the reserves, because there's not enough time to be messing around. You just don't have time to do all of the, stupid little things that aggravate people on active duty, because you only have essentially Friday, Saturday, Sunday to blow stuff up or set stuff up or run around your heavy equipment or do whatever it is. And there's a lot of really cool stuff to do in the reserves.
And the last thing I'll say, Dave, and this is something that you really don't understand until you've lived it, but is that connection to the American people. The reserve units, whether it's the, funeral honors piece and having that last touch point and being buried by your brothers and sisters in Marine uniforms that we do for every single Marine that served honorably, no matter where you are and what rank you were, to the Toys for Tots mission, where we're giving less fortunate children books and toys that otherwise wouldn't have that opportunity to have those things. And we're doing that in places that are away from major Marine Corps installations. And so we're the ones for the service that are in touch with the American people. And it's a really heavy responsibility, but it's also a great honor, because you get to represent your Corps to mom and pop America and to the people on the street that maybe have never seen a Marine before. And you get to be that person. It's amazing. We're the connective tissue to the American people.
Yeah, I agree. Well, anybody getting off active duty considering this, I think you can talk to Career Planner or drop me a DM and Instagram or something like that.
I'll talk to you.
I'll answer the question or find somebody that can
too.
Yeah, there you go.
Yep. Send me a note. I love to talk to those people and challenge them.
Yeah. Right. But it really is something to consider. So, well, Brigadier General Jackson, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your donating your personal time. You're a busy person to this project. I do think it makes a difference, and emerging leaders will definitely listen to this episode and glean a lot from it. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you stewarding the Marine Corps. I appreciate you continuing